Okay, good evening and welcome to tonight's Policy Governance Network meeting. I'm pleased to be here to host David Adler, who will be providing tonight's presentation. In the room with me tonight, and I should probably stop and say I'm Harry Frank from the School Boards Association, facilitating tonight's meeting. I'm joined by Val Gardner, Policy Governance Consultant and former principal. David, I'll ask you to introduce yourself a bit more when you pick up and start the presentation. Winton Goodrich is here as well, leadership consultant and former assistant superintendent and former School Boards Association director. So welcome. And then we're also joined by Tristan Tolino, representative from Brattleboro. Thanks for joining us tonight. The format for tonight's meeting will run about an hour. David will provide the substance of the presentation, and then those of us in the room tonight will serve as the panel of experts and thoughtful consumers and engage in a follow-up conversation. So that's the game plan. I'm going to pass the microphone over to you, David, and switch the screen, but would you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm David Adler. I'm the Curriculum Director for Williams Southwest Supervisory Union. I've been working there since June 2012. Prior to that, I've had a lot of different jobs in education, from principal to teacher to educational consultant, so all over the map. And today I'm here to talk about data and how we can use data to help us make some decisions that are hopefully a little more meaningful. So, should we get started? We're good to go?
I think we're good to go.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
So there's a lot of stuff in here, and I don't know if this is inappropriate, but I would ask if anyone has any questions, comments, or wants to throw a chocolate raise an hand, then please do so. So you know, just let me know if there's anything I say that you need to comment or ask or anything else. And as always, please tell me if I'm wrong. So we call this presentation Reclaiming the Floor, and that'll become apparent very quickly. So we started a project last year, and the reason why is that standards-based education was originally supposed to provide minimum competency levels for all students. That was the point. Is that all third graders would be able to do this, all eighth graders would be able to do this. That was the original point, was to set minimum. But the reality is now we've turned those minimum into maximum. We have to have 100% proficiency. We have to get everybody has to be in a particular place, and that has effectively turned the philosophy on its ear, because those floors have become ceilings, and you really can't get to the ceilings. I was at a presentation Monday where the new Secretary of Education said that she believes that 100% of schools in Vermont that are eligible to have an A1 rating will fail to make A1. And I've heard that of most states around, that everybody's going to fail because the standard is too high. We just can't get there. So if you have a standard, as educators, we know this, if you have a standard that is meaningless, then why have it at all? If you tell a student, well, I expect this out of you, but I know you're not going to deliver. This is a recipe for failure. So we said that what we wanted to do is we wanted to have new measures that were realistic, that were relative to our students, that really took into account characteristics of the test, characteristics of the students in our class, and have a different suite of measures at our disposal that would give us real feedback about how we were doing and how our students were doing in our classrooms. And so we call it reclaiming the floor, because we want to have a floor that we can stand on so that we can shoot things. So that's the goal. So here's part of our reality. As educators, we want our teachers, we want everybody using test data. Test data, as a lot of people say, it's a bad thing. Having data on students and what they can and can't do is a good thing, but it has to be useful. And in order for it to be useful, people have to actually believe in it. They have to believe that it has some level of meaning. It also has to be reported and aggregated in a way that makes sense to people, that actually provides meaningful feedback to people. It has to give us, we have to be able to see it in a way that we can actually do something with it. And it has to be actionable. That's very important. And the way it's reported to us, it's almost non-actionable. And this is an example here. This is a report that I get every year from Measure Progress. And it may be a little bit difficult to see from this far away. But if you look in that top left box there, that's the percentage of students over the course of 3 years at OSSU who scored level 3 and level 4, which are proficient and proficient and distinction. If you look at 2009-10, the combined rate was 15%. And our mean scaled score that year was 833. If you look at the following 2 years, in 2011-12, the combined rate was 33%, which is more than doubling what we had, and our mean scaled score is still 833. Now at the same time, at the state level, they went from 29% to 30%, which is almost the same thing, and they went from 835 to 835. So when our passing rate was half the states, we were 2 points below them. When our passing rate was higher than the states, we're still 2 points below them, and it doesn't help at all. We have no idea what any of this means. We have no idea how to plan around this, and most importantly, we have no idea how to affect any meaningful changes in our curriculum, in our instruction, in any of our programming to really help our students learn more. So this, to us, does not help, but it's what we're held accountable for. So what we wanted to say is, well, let's look at NECAP. Let's look at standardized tests. Let's look at what we're doing, and what is it that goes into a grade that students receive, and how can we look at the factors that are outside of institutional control? Now, how can we then control for them so that we're really just focused on what the institution is doing? So we start with students failing or succeeding, first because of the instruction or programming that we give them. We give them math textbooks. We give them certain instruction. We give them certain structures in the classroom. We also have their readiness to learn. That's a key component. Are they willing? Are they ready? What do they have? But also, test difficulty plays a part in this. Is the test, tests change in their difficulty levels. What the test focuses on in a math test, you might have 1 year significantly more geometry, and the next year significantly more numeracy. What are they focusing on? The conditions under which the test is given. Is it an online test? How is it given to students? What are the conditions in which they're taking the test? But also then the poverty of the students. That has a factor. We all know this. Some people will say it's as high as 50% of the student's grade is their situation of poverty. Their ability to read. So we know that when students take the science test, for example, it's a reading-intensive test. And we have students who know a lot about science and a lot about math who don't score well because they're having trouble reading the prompts or articulating their answers. We also have students with disabilities, and we also have students with language abilities, for example, students who English is not their first language. So these are all things that go into the grade that a student receives on the NCAP, and therefore the institutional grade that we see as a rating for how our schools are doing. Now, schools should be held accountable for some of this, but not all of it. And so what we tried to do was set up a series of normings that would control, first, for those three in that orange box there, factors about the test. And then we wanted to control for factors about the students, so that what you're left with in the analysis is things that really start to get at what is in the purview of the school. Are they preparing students to be ready to learn, and is their instruction actually facilitating learning? So that's what we were trying to do with this. Any questions so far?
Makes sense.
Okay. So we wanted to design our system. So we had a few controls we put on this. We had some requirements. So first, it had to be actionable and specific. We wanted to provide people with meaningful feedback, things that they could actually do something with. That was important. It couldn't just sort of sit out there and live in an ivory tower. We wanted to account for the factors that are real and have an effect, but distract from the conversations. So we find that a lot of times teachers will dismiss tests because, well, I have a lot of students in Title I. I have a lot of students in special education. That other classroom does not, or that other school does not. We wanted to strip all of that away and just focus on what are you doing with the kids that you have, and how are you educating those students. We had to look at ways to look at it in lots of different ways. So we had to be able to look at, for example, a cohort group and how a cohort group has changed as they have gone through their schooling, or how a particular grade level in the system is doing year by year by year, and what the changes are. So we had to be able to look different ways. And finally, we had to be able to ask it questions. We're running our data teams through this model, so we had to be able to make it flexible enough that people could ask questions of the system. So with those parameters in mind, we had to first determine what statistic we were tracking. So the first thing we did is we looked at, on the NECAP, the number of points that our students in our district had achieved in each subtopic of each of the exams for the last 5 years. So subtopics are those areas like geometry, numeracy, data and measurement, things like that. So we looked at the same statistic, how many points achieved, for everybody on the same tests in the entire state of Vermont. And then we calculated those as percentages of the available points. And that was important because what that does for us is that says, well, if there's 10 points available in a subtopic one year and only 5 in the next year, calculating them as percentages puts them on an equal playing field. You can say, okay, if you got 3 points out of 5 versus if you got 6 points out of 10, these are equivalent things as opposed to just comparing 3 points to 6 points. If we subtract those percentages, the percentage of points our students achieved versus the percentage of points that the students in the state of Vermont achieved, we get what is statistically referred to as a residual. And that is the statistic we looked at. And I'll show you exactly what it looks like. So this is a graph, and the purple line in this graph represents the percentage of points achieved by the state of Vermont on the 6th grade kneecap in geometry and measurement over the course of 5 years. And you can see that that goes up and down and up and down. The contention and the model that we're working under is that that does not say very much about the students as it does about the test. The test changes every year. So in 2008-9, the test was probably more difficult in geometry and measurement than it was in 2007-8 because the students got 50%, roughly 50% of the questions correct in 2007-8, and it looks like about 43% a year later. So we contend that the test was more difficult in that area. Yeah?
Let me ask a question.
Please.
How do you know the test is different?
The test is different? The test
Yeah.
is different every year. They make the test every single year.
But from a difficulty, you think it's different?
So the test difficulties, the way that state assessment systems tend to work, and Vermont works off of this theory as well, is that they look at test difficulty holistically. But within each subtopic, there may be some changes. So what they're trying to do is control for the test difficulty as a whole test, but within, the geometry one year may be harder than the numeracy, than the geometry next year, and vice versa.
So why didn't that affect your kids as much as it did the rest of the state?
Great question. So like you see, and you correctly point out, right, that the OSSU students are, following roughly the same pattern, but the swings are not as great. And if you look, the difference that we had in 2007-8 is more than the difference in, oops, sorry about that.
Wait, let me just do this.
Is that better?
We had this come up the last
You
time.
could say your kids are more resilient.
We could. Absolutely. Can you move your cursor?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Okay. So it is a possible explanation. I will not put any explanations on this at this point. I'm just describing. But what I will say is if we look at it as a residual, what you see is this is the trend, which is tracking where our students are relative to the state. And you see a very, very different picture, a general downward trend, that the gap between our students and the state tends to be growing in 6th grade geometry and measurement. It goes up and down, but that is controlled, that statistic is then controlled for characteristics of the exam itself. So when we show this to our staff, and we show this to principals and then anybody else, and they say, well, the test was hard this year, the test was easy this year, the test focused more on this subject, more or less on that subject, this controls effectively for those factors, and we can really talk about, well, where are we compared to where we ought to be, because that's where everybody else was in the state. So we've effectively normed each test individually and within each subtopic and within each grade level.
So you're saying the focus of this graph is on those two areas that schools can impact.
Mm-hmm. So, well, I'd say that schools cannot impact the factors with the test, right?
Right.
So what this does is strip that out.
Right.
It still doesn't account for the demographics and the characteristics of the students themselves, but it does norm effectively for characteristics of the test.
So part of the, just to jump in, I think that you showed us the two control groups, but you're going to build back to that, right?
Correct. So I believe it was the orange box is factors related to the test. So we have essentially done that. And if you want to see, this is another way of looking at it. This is a cohort group. So this is a class of students, and this is their experience going from 3rd through 7th grade and how they've done relative to the state. So, they started out 3rd grade below state averages. They were just about state average in 4th grade, a little above. Then they spent 2 years down, and then they went, in the 7th grade year, they went significantly higher.
So you're saying 0 is state average?
0 would be that our students were functioning at the state average level.
Okay.
So I don't know what happened in any of those years, but I do know that that's the first question I want to ask, right? That And what that does for me is this, like I said, this norms for characteristics of the exam itself.
One could say the teacher in 09, 010 didn't do a very good job because in 10, 11, I mean, that's where some people will go.
They certainly might, and I'm not ready to say that, but what I am ready to say, why do we ask and immediately put it on the teacher? Why don't we put it on the programming? Why don't we put it on, we know that, for example, in some districts, students transition buildings in different years, and that has an effect on their achievement.
Curriculum.
Sure.
Yeah, change in materials, change in curriculum, change in a lot of things, change in the structure of the day.
Sure. We had this problem once before.
Okay.
I think this.
That'll do it? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay,
No,
we good?
it's not your.
All right, so great questions. Should we go on to see some more? So what does this do for us? Well, like I said, we've controlled for issues related to test analysis, such as the focus of the test. We've normed for that. We've normed for the difficulty of the test. And we've normed for changes year by year. And so when the test looks different, we can actually effectively compare one year to the next year instead of saying, well, that was a different year, that was a different year, whatever those differences are. So, and this allows us then to start tracking changes in our loose cohort groups, and we can start to evaluate programming. You say it could be a teacher. It could be. Let's ask. Let's figure out ways to dig into that a little bit more.
Now, is this for your SU?
But we've actually done it for the entire state.
But I mean, when you're comparing, it's a Southwest, it's a Orleans Southwest cohort that you're comparing to the state.
Correct. So,
Okay.
but we have done it for everybody.
So you can't say it's a teacher. It's a teacher in every district, every one of your districts.
Well, we've done it by,
Orleans Southwest.
well, we've done it by a building. We've done it every way you can slice it.
But the bar graphs you were showing are
Is the
yes,
entire
yeah.
SU, because I don't want to publicly show
Right.
data about.
That's why.
Yep.
That's why I'm asking that question.
Yep, but we do have it. We have it by school. We have it, and we do not use this data. We do not use it to evaluate teachers. We do not use it to get into classrooms. That is not the purpose. And we are not after, we're not saying this one is doing a good job, this one is doing a bad job. That's not the evaluation. And we are not even using this for any sort of evaluation right now. What we're using it for is to ask questions and to bring people together and say, this is what we're seeing as trends. Why do you think we're seeing this as trends? And as a basis for action research.
Do your board see this?
They do.
You set the context and the parameters before.
We do, and we also keep it at a relatively high level for them.
Yeah.
Because we don't want them using it, because as you say, it's a very attractive thing to go into, start to evaluate. But we don't want to
told
do
you she wasn't any good. Now we can prove it.
exactly, and we don't want to go there, because I don't think that's appropriate, but I also don't think it's accurate. I don't think that's what this tells us yet. So you ready to see sort of round two, what it looks like to strip out more stuff? So how do we isolate then extraneous factors, namely the characteristic of the students? So we don't have a standard based on the students. One of the things we say to teachers is you don't teach curriculum, you teach kids. Well, then we shouldn't be assessing curriculum, we should be assessing students. And so we need to know who our students are and place reasonable expectations on those students. So we want to say, are we meeting their needs? And we want to put legitimacy to that. And we want to look at the demography of the student body, and we do not want to reduce expectations. One thing we say every time we talk about this, demography is not destiny. We believe every student can achieve to every possible level, but we do know that the demographics of a school as a whole has a determining factor on the achievement of that school as a whole. So we want to set a context of who's in the seats and where should the school be achieving as that, and how are they achieving relative to that particular standard. So how does it work? Well, we took the demographics of every school in the state of Vermont over the course of 5 years. And we created a demographic index, and we compared that index to achievement. By doing that, we then can create a predictive model. How does demographics predict achievement? And looking at how the demographics predicts achievement, we can then compare that predicted model of achievement back to how they actually achieved, and then compare those two things. And that comparison gives us an answer. And I want to say this again, we don't think demography is destiny. We are looking at groups of students, we are looking at schools as a whole, we're evaluating institutions, not kids. That's very important. So these are the results and how it looks in my supervisory union. So according to this, the entire supervisory union should be, theoretically, scoring 2 percentage points lower than the state of Vermont. So if you looked at that graph that we had before where students were starting in 3rd grade at roughly 2 percentage points below, that actually, according to the demographic model, puts them right about where they quote-unquote should be based on who we have in the seats. And when they shot up to just over that 0, they were actually outperforming expectations. Now, this is another way of looking at it. This is actually an analysis of the 6th grade geometry and measurement test over the course of 2 years. And if you see in this chart, in 2010-11, we had 17 points available in geometry on the test. The following year, we only had 16. We earned 6.85 and then 6.68, which is 40% and then 43%. So we went up by 3 percentage points. At the same time, the state went from 46 to 54 percentage points. They went up 8 percentage points. So the residual for us is the 40 to 46. We were below by 6 percentage points. The following year, we're below by 11 percentage points. Now, I can explain 2 percentage points of that away through demographics. I'm still left with 4% and then 9% that I can't explain. What I do know is that that 4% and that 9% are not explainable by anything that has anything to do with the tests, the difficulty of the test, what they were choosing to focus on the test, nor does it have anything to do with how many kids I have on IEPs, their socioeconomic status, whether or not they're limited English proficient. It has something to do with something going on inside the walls of our school. And I don't know what it is. It may not, it could be a teacher, it could not, it could be programming, it could be a lot of things. It could be the color of the paint on the walls. I have no idea, but I do know that it's something in there. And we got to start asking what it is. So this is a graph for us. This is another cohort group, and it's a little bit difficult to see those lines, but each colored line represents a subtopic on the reading test. And so you can see that we have a general downward trend for us, even when you reference the demographics of our students, and that they're starting out in 4th grade, this particular group. The 0 line represents, in this case, the state average adjusted for the demographics. So the 0 line is at expected value, and our group started out above it. And as we go year by year, they're starting to trend downwards, which means that our students are not being able to keep up with the same level that the state is, which we need to look at our programming, and are we pushing our students forward? Are we pushing them enough, and are they getting what they need to keep pace with the rigors of state-level curriculum?
Did you factor in increase or decrease the poverty rate over that same period of time?
Mm-hmm. Yep, each year is normed individually.
Okay.
So,
And is that aligned with this downward?
Mm-hmm.
Is there an increasing level of poverty?
We've controlled for poverty, so
Okay.
it's
So it's
this
not
graph
an
is controlled, so it's not
Okay.
a piece of the analysis since it's been stripped out.
I got it.
So,
Okay.
and, special education rates change too. All of those things change. So, how are we doing? Well, maybe we need to look at our programming year by year and literacy and how is that doing for this particular group of kids. This may not be the same graph for every other cohort group. It may not be the same graph everywhere. But for this particular group of kids, we need to really examine what's the programming, what's going on. And I would like to know, it's hard to see on this from where you're sitting, but there's clearly a downward trend in all of these, but what's going on with informational text, which is that green line? That seems to be the bellwether. When we're good, that one's at the highest. When we're doing poorly, that one's at the lowest. That one seems to be one that we may want to look at first. So it's I think a legitimate question, and we don't know, but we're asking that question. So if you look at the analysis, what we set out to do, if you remember, because we're using those residuals comparing back to the state, we put control number 1 in place, which controls for those factors. Because we're using demographically adjusted proficiency measures, we're controlling for the characteristics of the students, which is control number 2. We've stripped those things out. So when we have conversations about institutional fidelity and how we're doing with programming in our students, what's left is our student readiness and our instruction and programming. And what else is there? So whatever our results are, these indicate how we are doing with our students. And what do we need to be doing, and where are we doing this well, and where are we not doing this as well, and where do we need to start asking more questions?
Does the demographic, does Woodbury have the same demographics that the other communities do?
They do not.
Okay. So that's the veteran community of Montpelier.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. And the thing to remember is we did not base this on the demographics of the town. We based this on the demographics of the school.
Right.
So it's who's got the butts in the chairs. And
It was a sample. I mean, one of the things
that always comes into play when you're doing this is what's the size of the sample you're dealing with, because of the, I mean, when you're doing controls, and my sense would be some of those would be pretty small.
They are. The maximum percent error in the statistic is about a half a percentage point. It goes down to around 0.2 of a percentage point. So certainly well within tolerances. And I'll actually show you the tool as it exists. And you can certainly factor that into your analysis. But I mean, it works well enough to see some really good trends. So yeah, the smallest school I analyzed in the state had a population of, I want to say, 17 students. And you know, they were, like I said, plus or minus 0.5, 0.6%.
The piece that you're doing is you're doing a school-wide analysis on the demographics.
Correct.
And
I'm sorry.
therefore, the assumption is that the school-wide mirrors the grade-wise.
We actually do it both ways. So we actually look at it in two ways. And we actually do, when we do the representative analysis, we actually look at how many students are in each grade. And so the expectation then flows from, because if you have a small school and you have 10 kids in the 3rd grade and you have 4 kids in the 6th grade, so we actually take that into account as well, and then who those students are.
Yeah, which just, in terms of that, I think the SU level data would, I feel, a little more secure with than the 3rd grade in Woodbury, which has 5 kids.
You bet. And so, and so what we do, you know, that's one of the reasons we do not publish grade level data in a particular school, that we sort of keep the analysis there.
Great.
I actually have for you a little later one of the graphs from our schools that I will show you. I stripped all the names off so you can't tell who it is. But this is just as an example of sort of how we use those and how we drive the conversations forward. Because I think internally we do have those conversations. But you're absolutely right.
What's your methodology you're using? Is this regression analysis? What are you doing to be able to get at these data?
To get at which data?
So all the data that you're using, are there particular methodologies that you're using?
To gather the data or to analyze the data?
To analyze it.
So it's actually, the algorithm is something that I actually am pursuing a patent for. Yeah, I am. So because it is relatively new, but you know, it is at least at the high level as described here, which is, you know, creating a model statewide of sort of off of random sampling, and then comparing what we would predict back to what it is that we actually see. And so it's basically error checking in reverse.
So predictive errors, I'm just trying to think what that, there's a particular methodology that uses predictor analysis. I can't think of it.
Oops. Are you losing here? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, keep going.
All right. So one of the other things that we're doing with this, and this is another way to sort of slice the data, is when I started at OSSU, one of the rhetorical comments that was made frequently is that special education students were dragging down the aggregate. So what we did is we actually looked at the results for our students and compared special education students at OSSU to only special education students statewide, and then the aggregate to the aggregate statewide. And this is the graph that we saw. And so one of the things, and then again, it adjusted for demographics. So what you see is that our special education students actually had been, for a while, outperforming the aggregate, and they're certainly not underperforming the aggregate when you norm them for who they are, you know, what their disabilities are. Now, one of the problems with this analysis, and there's actually significantly more error built in here, is because this treats all special education students the same, right? And you know, we could have, in one particular group, we could have an inordinate number of students who have just a very, very minor disability that need just a very, very minor accommodation, versus some other places that do our percentages of students in each disability category mirror those statewide.
And when you're saying all grades, help me understand what that means.
All grades who took an exam, so anyone who took a test that year. So it's just 3rd, 4th, all of them put together. And again, built into a representative model. So this, what I'm saying is this is just not the 6th grade test, the 7th grade test. It's all.
So these are
sampling.
And one of the reasons to do that is what you pointed out earlier, which is we have 1,000 students, and 180 of them on IEPs. When you start to get into grades and the special education, you're starting to look at significantly smaller sample sizes. So that's one of the reasons we put them all together, is to actually have some meaning within that.
And so these special ed students are taking the regular NECAP and not the one with accommodation.
Correct. We did not. We did not include those students who took the ALT and
right.
the other exams.
Back up just for a minute.
Oh, sure.
So the aggregate is the state?
So the aggregate is our students as compared to the state, and it's all students.
Okay.
Versus the special education is our special education students as compared only to special education students.
It is the aggregate, including the special education.
It is.
So your SPED kids are doing better than your regular kids.
They certainly were for a long time. Now they're sort of running parallel. But I think the argument that they're dragging us down doesn't really hold any water. And that if we are going to, certainly there's an achievement gap of where we want to be and where we are. But if we're going to take that on, we would be misusing resources to look at it as a special education issue. Special education appears to be doing exactly what it's intended to do. We really need to look at it as a general education programming issue. And so, we're not focusing our energies on trying to remake our special education systems. We're really focusing our energy on what is our regular education programming looking like, and how is that addressing the needs of our students.
Interesting. So one might say, with tongue-in-cheek, all kids on IEPs, they'll do better.
Mm-hmm.
Second issue is with flexible pathways learning,
Mm-hmm.
personal learning plans. Might they improve the performance like that of IEP kids?
So, your guess is as good as mine how this data would look on a different instrument. And so my computer says I'm muted. Is that
Sorry,
true?
so we just switched the mics.
Okay.
So we're running off this mic now because when we go to a discussion, we'll pass the mic around.
Okay.
Yeah, the best.
Okay.
Pick
Cool.
up.
Have you run this by people who do this work?
Do which one?
profession, meaning this data analysis?
So my methodology was run past people at the Agency of Education who said it was sound and worth pursuing. I also ran it past.
Was that Michael Hawk?
He was one of the people. So
Okay.
there were several others there who could not find any fault with the methodology or the results. I also am a member of the Department of Education at the University of Massachusetts. I'm pursuing my doctorate. And there's a couple of psychometricians there who sort of work on this stuff. And I ran the methodology past them as well, and they referred to it, and I quote, as novel but sound. There's meaning to be made there. But as I said, it's sort of, we're creating new methodology for looking at measures of institutional success. So this has not been done before, to the best of my understanding.
It'd be a good political, maybe not the word political, but run it by Sean and Karen Colleen at UVM.
Okay.
Those would be two good people who know quite a bit about this.
Okay.
Bud Myers is gone; he's retired,
Mm-hmm.
but he would have been a person to take a look at this.
Well, I would certainly be happy to do so. Maybe
Yeah.
we'll talk a little later.
Yeah.
Okay, so shall we continue?
Yeah.
So, all right, so this is, as I said, I took out the school name here, but these are grade level results adjusted for the demographics. And you can see trends in a grade level, and it's different kids, right? Because, third grade one year, third grade next year. So the question about how much meaning to be made there. But one of the features of this graph is that black line is a good faith estimate. It's roughly plus or minus about 3/4 of a percentage point as to where we would need to be making AYP. And so this sort of helps put that ceiling on the graph. And if we say we needed a floor, if that 0 mark of demographically adjusted state level performance was our floor, and we have this ceiling, we can see we actually had a couple classes that were above the ceiling that were doing significantly better than expected, but we have some who are not. And so what did we need to do, and where do we need to attack this problem, and what are the trends? So it's one of the ways that we're facilitating conversations with this data and with this level of analysis.
Interesting.
So David, this is the same group of students as they progress from 3rd to 6th grade.
So this is, each line represents a grade level, and
It's
so
the
it's
same
different
cohort.
kids. No, it's not. These are not cohort groups. This is 3rd grade in one year, the
Okay,
3rd grade
okay.
the next, 3rd grade the next. So each line represents a different grade level.
Okay.
So it is different groups of kids, and one can certainly argue that it is not fair to make that analysis. And we have those conversations, but this is one of the ways that we look at it. We also look, as you see, with cohort groups in a wide variety of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So there is meaning to be made here if, as Wynn points out, is it a teacher? Well, you could make an argument, and I wouldn't, but you could make an argument that as a teacher, if you have the same teacher in the same classroom every year and their results are consistently low, then then it maybe isn't something in the building, maybe it's something in the room. You still could say it's the resources, or it's it's that teacher has 30 kids in the room every year. It could be a lot of other things. But if you can analyze and say, what, we've had the same teacher teaching third grade for 5 years, and the third grade is always the lowest grade in the class, and it's not here. But if it were, you might be able to start to think about what is that teacher doing.
Well, you might be able to make this is again your SU.
Mm-hmm.
You might say
This is one school in my SU.
oh, this is one school.
This is one school.
Oh, one could say that I can't see my colors well. But
Yeah.
fifth grade teacher, so when they test in sixth grade,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
you could say
you could.
Yeah.
So and then
My caution would be, it's more interesting what you see as trends and what questions does it make you ask.
I would absolutely agree with that.
Because I think we jump much, I'd be saying, so what happens to kids in sixth grade?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree.
They go to Hazen.
Mm-hmm.
oh, did they go to Hazen? In
Some of them.
sixth?
Some of them.
So Hazen starts at 7th grades, but
So,
Yeah.
But you begin at those are the types of things rather than jumping to I would think jumping
Yeah.
to a
I agree. And we have a data team model that we've employed around this idea of rolling out this new sort of way of looking at data. And what we ask people to do is start with a question. And then, we have this iterative process, and we frequently end with a question as well.
So I'm curious, so you've got one data point that a lot of this analysis is done on, which is the kneecap.
Yes. So, yeah.
So are there supporting documents or data points that you're including with this?
So the focus of this presentation is that we believe that the contention that NECAP as a test, as essentially the sole measure of institutional accountability, if that is the direction that we are going to be pushed into, we would like the ability to use a different level of analysis to look at that. That being said, we have a pretty robust district-based assessment system that we use to drive other forms of analysis, and we have lots of other data we use.
And are you doing analysis of comparing that system
Mhm.
with what results you get?
We do.
NECAP?
Yep, quite a bit.
So you're getting some triangulation.
Yeah, and we also are bringing in, and part of the data protocol is that we're bringing in classroom data from teachers and asking teachers, how are you making meaning out of this as well? And so, we basically say, what's it, the three blind monks and the elephant, one feels the tail and thinks it's a snake, and, I don't remember how the parable goes. But that what we say is, if you just look at NECAP results, you get only one view of what a student does, and if you just look at district-based assessment and just classroom assessment, we want to look at it all. So this is, as you point out, this is only an initiative that we're using based around NECAP. We are also going to push this with SBAC as well.
Well, that was going to be my question, because the state board right now, the step to that is the state board's got to go through the ESEA waiver to be able to move to the growth model rather than the NECAP.
So this is not a growth model.
I know it's not,
Yeah.
but Smarter Balanced is.
It has the potential to be, but it does not have to be. So, what we're going to do is we're going to look specifically at the results. We've looked at the preliminary results that came out. We did a pilot last year.
Okay.
And, how do we get that data, and what does it look like, and then how can we use that? And we're pretty confident that we can do a similar level of analysis. It's just changing the instrument.
Really?
Yep. So that we can still control for those things. Because ultimately the whole point is, if you're going to tell me that I'm accountable for educating students, then measure how I'm educating students. Don't measure how much money their parents have. Right? And that's, and we'll actually get there. I have a slide about that. So we've talked a little bit about this. We can look at our schools, but one of the other benefits is, since we've done this as a statewide analysis, we actually can look at schools that are demographically similar to our own, but who are outperforming us. And so, where we are, we frequently start to compare ourselves to, Morrisville and Stowe, and people object to that because, Stowe, they have so much money. Why are we comparing ourselves to them just because they're 15 miles away from us? Why aren't we comparing ourselves to schools that actually have students of roughly similar caliber? So characteristic. Sorry. So, and as I said, we're having our data meeting protocols that we use for this. So this is actually an example of one of the ways we use it, and these are 3 schools. So Hardwick Elementary is one of our schools, and the demographic index, which I referred to earlier, is sort of a combination of the 3 factors: percentage of students on special education, percentage of students receiving free and reduced lunch, which is an indicator of poverty, and percentage of students who are receiving English language learner services. And you can see that they're not identical, but they're very, very similar. And that these three schools are very similar or these two schools are very similar to Hardwick Elementary. And you could argue that they have roughly equivalent students representatively. Every kid is different, but the representation is very similar of who's in the desks. But when we look at the achievement, we look at adjusted residual. So that is the overall adjusted residual for math and literacy combined. And our Hardwick Elementary in this last year was about a percentage point below the expectation, even when you adjust for demographics. The Newport Elementary was about 3 1/3 percentage points above the expected value, and Lake Region was almost 8 percentage points above.
Now, Lake Region's a middle high school.
Correct, but since we have normed for grade level,
So it doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter.
Okay.
So, and you can also see the percent of students who are proficient or proficient above in literacy and mathematics, and you can start to look at those comparisons. And what do we have that we can learn from them? And quite frankly, I have no idea. But what I do know is whatever's going on up there, and if it's consistent, then whatever's going on up there, what is it that they're doing that we could be doing too? Because they clearly have some magic sauce that we don't have. So what can we go and learn from their teachers and their administrators and their structures and their boards? Because they're moving their kids in a direction that we are not yet. And I will say that our teachers are actually, Hardwick Elementary is on a significant upward trend. They're doing a great job there. They're really moving things in a wonderful direction. I'm not trying to bash any of our schools. I think they're really doing a great job. But we're not where they are. And why reinvent the wheel if we don't have to?
So you're saying Newport Elementary with an index of 1.18 means they have more ELL, more SPED, and higher poverty.
The combination of those
Yes.
things, so not individually perhaps.
I'll tell you one thing Newport may have different is they're a Roots of Success school.
There you go.
And so that is more connection to parents. As a result of that, that could have some impact on this.
You absolutely could very well be right. And what we are trying to do, we're actually starting to set up site visits from our administrators and our teachers who are coming from our schools to go to other schools to see what they're doing as a result of this analysis. So
Check out Montgomery Elementary.
that is actually, we are going there, I want to say in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the ones we're looking at.
You'll find some sauce there.
Yeah, well, and I mean, actually, not to skip ahead, but in doing this analysis, their adjusted residual is the highest in the state.
Yeah, and the performance outperforming any other school district.
They are, absolutely. So they're doing a fantastic job. So here's a test for you. So this is when we.
And before we get to the test, I'll just say that we heard the principal speak in a workshop a couple of years ago. She does like 3,000 observations a year.
Wow.
She's always in classrooms, and it's the 13 effective school research variables, and that's laser focus on instruction. And she's the leader on that.
That's great. So we need to learn from that. So here's your test. So I have 3 schools. These are actual schools in the state of Vermont. I'm not going to tell you who they are. These are their adjusted residuals for the last 5 years overall, combination of all the tests. So they have vastly different AYP stati. So if you're not aware of sort of AYP status, what happens is a school can be making AYP. They can get a probationary year. After they get a probationary, if they fail to make AYP, they go into school improvement year 1, school improvement year 2, and then corrective action year 1 through, I believe the highest right now is they have 1 school in corrective action year 8.
It's probably Bennington.
So can you identify, based on those adjusted residuals, where these schools are?
No.
They look roughly the same? There's some ups and downs? If you were to characterize these schools' performance based on the demographically adjusted indicator, what would you say about them?
I wouldn't,
No.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't characterize them?
I wouldn't even characterize their performance.
Would you say, though, I mean, I would put a word on it that of slight underperformance based on expectations? Is that a reasonable or fair thing to say? For all of
I'd
them?
say probably number 2 is as far as the
See, I would look at the data. I can't make a determination. I would make an assumption based, if I were to take a Montgomery. The interesting piece is the trend piece. I mean,
Absolutely.
Looking at mystery school number 1 to go from a 0.5 to a .47.
Underperformance, right?
Yeah.
And what happened in that year? So I will tell you that mystery school number 1 has made AYP every year that there has been AYP. Mystery school number 2 is in school improvement year 2, so they've missed AYP for 3 years. Mystery school number 3 is in corrective action year 5, which means they missed it for every year for the last 8 years. But
Really?
and there does not appear to be, at least if it's based off of the kneecap, once you adjust for demographics, there doesn't appear to be a tremendous, significant difference in the achievement level once we strip away demographics and test characteristic between these schools. They certainly have some volatility in there, but they are largely similar. They are more similar in their achievement than they are different. But if you look at the median household income for the towns where the schools reside, you get the mystery school number 1 has 50% greater median household income than mystery school number 3, which is a significant difference. And it begs a question, what are we assessing when we look at something like straight percent proficiency as a measure of institutional fidelity? So,
Question that comes to my mind: Can you take this kneecap analysis outside of a kneecap assessment to be some other kind of an assessment? I'm thinking about Reeves's work in Wisconsin, the 90-90-90 schools.
Yeah.
Is there a way to align those to say there's some accuracy in the research he's done, or there isn't?
as long as there's enough data, as long as it's been given in a similar way in enough institutions that you can start to see differences between places, then absolutely.
I'd be interested to know.
So, there's more. What just happened?
Do you have anything on your screen?
Nope, I went blank for some reason. Let's see. There we go. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. All right, so what happens next? What happens as a result of this? So what we did is we actually created 2 measures of institutional effectiveness. And our goal is not to ditch percent proficiency at all. We like percent proficiency. We think it's an indicator of something. We don't think it's the only indicator. So we have this indicator that we created called demographically adjusted proficiency. We also created the blueprint for and all the algorithms for growth measures. So individual student growth measures, there's a high percentage of data to value-added measures, looking at where did the student come from in 3rd grade and where are they in 4th grade and what's the difference between the two. Individually, there's a lot of error in there, but when you aggregate them, you can get that error significantly down. And so what we're looking at is not student level data, but institutional level data. And so if we aggregate student growth measures, we can have a sort of a different triangulated look of the same test, all on the same test, but different ways of looking at the data. The AOE has to this point not provided me with the data that I need to actually complete that level of analysis, so I'll keep you posted if that changes. But the measure exists, it's there, the algorithm is written. So what we're doing with this now is what we're trying to do is triangulate, or in this case biangulate, the measures that we have of institutional success, and we're looking at how they relate to the inputs. So things like how we spend our money, where that money comes from, the structures of our special education programs. I'm even looking at how much a school lunch costs. I'm looking at actually the Vermont School Boards Association was very generous. I came down here a couple of weeks ago and they allowed me to photocopy tons and tons of contracts from across the state. How much time on learning, what are teachers being asked to do, how much are they being paid, just looking at what do we throw at our kids and how does that relate to demographically adjusted measures of institutional success and traditional measures of institutional success.
I've got another measure for you to look at.
Please.
In 2002, the country dedicated 64% of instruction, of the resource to instruction. At the end of Nickleby, where we are now, it's 60. Be interested to know what Orleans Southwest is as a percent, because I can tell you that Brent K. and Orange Southwest is 75%.
Okay.
So thinking about those issues, putting your resources where it matters most is a piece of all of this.
So what we have is actually, and this may not be a good indicator of that, but what we have is what percentage of the per pupil expenditure goes towards each of the spending categories. Instructional leadership, actual instruction, teachers in the classroom, retirement packages, buildings, maintenance. I actually did a project like this for the Massachusetts Charter School Association years ago, and I asked, the research question was, if you had $1 extra to put in any spending category, what portion of it would you put in what spending category? And the conclusion from the data, which I found was endlessly fascinating, was that really the only place you would want to put it is in building maintenance, and that nothing else from a spending standpoint seemed to have any real effect on student outcomes as determined by state test scores, which was fascinating. I did not get to sort of follow up and try to figure out why and what, but I mean, you can come up with some theories about it, but it is an interesting sort of finding. So, but we're going to look at that. So some of the things that we have found out so far is that if you look at the presence of technology in schools, it has absolutely no perceivable effect on student outcome. So we looked at our students in one-to-one programs, how many computers do they have, how many iPads, laptops, and what was the bandwidth at the school. We found there's absolutely no correlation between any of those things and any measure of student outcome whatsoever. And the conclusion that we're drawing is it's not enough just to throw tech at them. You need to really focus on your pedagogy and how you're using the tech and how an implementation plan. The other one is that, we hear this a lot, is that teacher salaries. And we have this theory that what we need to do is we need to raise teacher salaries, and what that'll do is that'll attract better teachers who will be better at educating our students, and therefore they will score better on their assessments. And there is some break in that chain. And so what we found is that if you look at the correlation between teacher salary and percent proficiency, there's a pretty decent correlation there. It's not great, but 0.4 is not bad. But if you demographically adjust the measures of proficiency, there's no correlation whatsoever with teacher salary and average teacher salary of an institution and how students are doing on their state exams.
I would, if you haven't already, I would think another interesting variable would be longevity of administrators in positions that drive the vision.
We actually have some preliminary data on, not with administrators, but with teachers. One of the things we are finding is that teachers, the percentage of teachers in the building who have been there longer than 3 years actually does have a positive effect on student learning. And it's not their longevity in the career as a teacher, it's being in the building for longer than 3 years. We have no evidence to suggest that the longer they're there, the more effective they are, but if they're there longer than 3 years, they tend to do better than not being there longer than 3 years. So that's interesting. So we're actually looking for some more data. We actually got all this data, like I said, spending, revenue sources, teacher and administrator retention rates, enrollment, how they're staffing, whether we have highly qualified teachers, years of service, licensure, technology, things like that. Vermont School Boards Association provided a lot of information about contracts, so I'm working through synthesizing a lot of that information. I'll be honest, it's a project, but I'm working on it because it's just me and I just do this in my spare time, which I have none. But I'm slogging through it. It's absolutely fascinating. And the goal is, we have a tool that we put out, and I'll actually show you the tool right now. The goal is to put this information into the tool itself, and then to make it available for free. The first tool was made available for free all over the state, and to just provide it to people so that they can look at, okay, so these are those demographically comparable schools. What are they doing that you're not? And instead of just having to pick up the phone and ask them that question, maybe you can get some preliminary information right away. How are they structuring their revenue streams? How are they spending their money? How much does a school lunch cost? And does that matter? And so, actually looking into creating best practice guides that are individualized to the schools based on demographic information. And I've been all over the state, working with different supervisory unions, presenting at conferences, and we do this specifically for free. So that we can just sort of get the word out about how these things are working.
I would encourage you when you do this to set it up in like a pivot table format so that people could just plug in the data without actually having to know how to do all the work.
Well, let me show you what it looks like, because we actually released this tool for free to anyone who wants it. So here's the tool. And so as you pointed out earlier, do we want to compare our schools to every school in the state, or do we want to just focus on elementary, middle, or high schools? And so what the tool allows you to do is to limit your candidate pool So do you want to look at all schools? Do you want to look at just elementary schools, middle, high schools? What do you want to look at?
Look at elementary.
Okay. So it brings you up to this module right away, and there's really only a few places on the screen that you can actually affect any change. But the first thing you do is you pick a school, and the drop-down contains just about every school in the state of Vermont. So who do you want to look at?
Let's look at Montgomery.
All right.
Now this is going to do a comparison.
It will.
So let's compare Montgomery to Hardwick.
Well, what it does is it compares to the demographically similar schools. So what this does is when you select the school,
Oh, I see.
it populates this automatically with the 10 most demographically similar schools in the state. And so then what it does is it gives you the grades served by the school, the total enrollment in the school, the last 2 years of student demographics, and then over here you get 2 years of this over-under performance index, which is what we've been talking about.
And this compares Montgomery to Williston and Marquette.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
And, you can look at the data if you like. You can see that what you have in Montgomery is 20% of the students on free and reduced lunch, 10% on IEPs, and 2.5% receiving ELL
It's only
services.
20% of Montgomery.
That is what they reported. And this is for the last year, 20%, 10%. That is what they reported to the state. Or at least that's the data the state has.
Wow, that surprises me.
Yep. So, but what we have here is if you look in this over-under performance index, that demographically adjusted residual, you can see that they are about 10 percentage points above in reading, about 18.5 percentage points above where they should be in math, and about 14 percentage points overall. What this does is it highlights the top 3 in green. So there's 11 schools total, and it highlights for you the top 3 schools in green so that you can start to say, well, who do I want to compare myself to? It also, over here, contains this measure of proficiency. So last 2 years of proficiency, and again, it highlights the top schools. Below, what it allows you to do is it allows you to then pick 3 of those schools that you want to look at a little bit more closely. Anyone you want to look at?
Look at Randolph.
Is that on the list?
Should be. Oh, no, maybe not.
No?
No, I guess it isn't. Yeah, because their poverty is much higher. They've got like 50%.
So these are it only allows you to select one school from the list of from the cohort list of
Pick
the
Williston.
all right. We can look at up to 3. Would you like to look at any others?
Yeah, let's look at Jericho and Underhill.
Yeah.
Which is in the supervisory union that I'm in, so that's why I'm curious.
Sure. So what this does is this then puts on that the last 5 years of the over-under performance index for the school as a whole on this graph. And you can see, Montgomery is here in blue. You can see Underhill, and you can see the opposite trends. You can see here the other 2 schools, Jericho and Williston, hovering around here, just above state average.
State average.
Demographically adjusted state average, right? You can also see for math what it looks like there.
Wow.
And then you can see the overall, what it looks like there. And so you can start to look for trends over, instead of just looking at 2 years, you can look at 5 years worth of data and start to think about what is going on with these schools, what happened here, what happened there, what's going on. I was actually, I did this with a relatively small school, and one of the fascinating things is when the data called up, there was this point where there's this spike, it's relatively low, and then bang, it just went through the roof. And every single person in the room said, that was the year we got the principal. This principal turned the whole school around. That was the year. That's what it is. They were absolutely certain. I'm not so sure, but they seemed sure. But, looking at this, you can start to say, well, what did we do in these years, and what happened, and should we dig a little deeper?
Well, that would have been the year after they got the principal, I would think.
That was, but that's what they pointed
Okay.
to specifically. That was when it happened. That's what it was.
Unless it's God coming in.
Yeah. So, and then, here we have similar charts for if you wanted to use percent proficiency as your measure, and you can look specifically at how is the school doing as percent proficiency as an indicator, and you can compare yourself to that. So the goal is to sort of put behind this, once you start to look at those and identify those schools, to be able to look at a far more in-depth comparison, not just to what those schools are doing, but what are some identified best practices, create a best practices model based on the data, and then to look at the practices in the identified schools. What are they doing? What are you doing? And is it working?
Slide that screen back so I can see that index again.
Sure.
So this is percent proficiency. What's this?
This is the demographically adjusted proficiency index.
Okay.
Looks very different, doesn't it?
Wow. Huh. Okay. Got it. This is fascinating.
Well, thank you. So that's my presentation. How'd I do?
Well, it's interesting to see it a second time. Because I think the first time I was trying to make sense of it, and now I'm curious about looking at who's doing what. But anyway, I'm curious whether there are other, I mean, I know people have been commenting all along. I'd like to take a few more minutes to hear any other comments or questions for you.
Sure.
So,
I'll just jump in. Well, so from the policymaking perspective, when I saw this, I right away realized that this is the kind of analysis that some of the people in the legislature who have been trying to figure out, like, how do we get to some understanding of what's actually happening. They're desperate for more clear understanding, and what I particularly like about it is it really focuses on where it gets away from the sort of assumptions and ideology into a place where we can actually have a conversation about what effectively is happening. And then even more than that, I like the fact that that David, in releasing it freely to his peers, is actually encouraging a peer learning model as opposed to a legislative policy decision or an agency policy decision trying to force a new learning system on people. I think that there's real power in people being able to see their data in new ways and understand that they can learn from each other about what's actually happening. And it strips away the ideology, and then it also allows for meaningful conversations among peer groups.
Thank you.
Which is why I've been trying to support David in getting access to a richer data set and dealing with somebody, kind of getting him to some of the policymakers so that they can understand that there are options for the kinds of questions that they're trying to look at.
let me make a point of passing this because that message, I think, suggests that
wasn't
people,
loud enough.
well, yeah, so other comments?
So where should I go next?
Well, my hope in having you present to this group is obviously to foster some of what you just described, Tristan, the kind of just peer learning or collegial exchange. I'm pleased to hear you talk about the policy implications, or at least the value this affords in terms of good information from which to have policy level discussion.
I could follow up on that for just a second.
Sure.
Yeah. I was an attendee at the all-day conference on Monday that was organized as I think an opportunity to try to deepen the legislative understanding of education policy. And I said this to David before the event. I said, I'm worried about the legislative tendency, and not just legislative tendency, but human tendency to sort of plant your flag, draw a little circle around your flag, and then proclaim your point of view really loudly and hope that that's somehow going to inform the debate. And it doesn't, what I think this work does is it actually forces us to abandon that a little bit, because it takes us out of our comfort zone, and it forces us to sort of ask deeper questions, and gives us an opportunity to follow up on those questions. And I think David has been very clear about not trying to overuse what the data says, instead of not rush to conclusions. So don't assume automatically that it's a teacher performance, because it might be a whole host of other things. But we can at least eliminate some of the things that are typically part of either sort of the ideological framing of education policy, or, if you will, the default tendencies of those conversations for people to kind of cluster around their flag, whether it's the demographic issue or whether it's accountability, depending, various perspectives where people tend to sort of rally to that position and not really move past it. So, that just to follow up on sort of even very recently how this, I think, could become a really important part of our conversation.
I'll tell you what came to my mind is it would be very interesting, given that you're in a policy governance district, to look at and do comparisons of districts that are traditional governance and policy governance, those that have clear ends and a clear process, and those that are traditional, and see if that makes a difference.
That's a great idea.
Well, that's interesting, because I guess my last question would be, how does this apply to school boards specifically, but maybe leadership more broadly? And so when I understand your comment to be, maybe that's a variable which could be plugged into this system to look for any kinds of trends. But have you thought about other implications for leadership of these organizations? So not the legislative dimension, but the actual school leadership, educational leadership.
I think one of the big conversations we're having in our supervisory union at board level right now is this question of measurement. Right? And I mean, our boards got together and they did a phenomenal job creating ends. And I look over I live in the districts where I work, and my kids go to the schools, and I can't disagree with anything they said. But as a person who works there, I have a very difficult time measuring some of those things.
Yeah.
I can't disagree with any of them, but I don't know how it is I'm supposed to measure something like develops a lifelong love of learning. And I agree that our schools should do that. But I think, one of the questions, and I don't think that this in any way measures a lifelong love of learning, or even the half of what we're trying to do, but I think opening the conversation about how do we measure, how do we set standards, how do we, are we locked into rigid models, or are we willing to really consider what are we doing and how are we doing, and how are we evaluating ourselves and our own performance, and can we set standards for ourselves? I think, that's a very big conversation, and I think, I see a lot of boards having it, and I applaud it, but it's certainly not easy.
Where my head was when I said that is, I was only looking at NECAP scores in districts that are PG versus those that are not.
Yeah, and I agree that it would be really interesting to see, are there trends, and how about, can you identify the breakpoint of where people adopted policy governance, and did it lead to a lag, and then ultimately they got caught up, and then it led to, or does that not happen? What happens? How does it work? So that, if you're considering doing that or considering not doing that, you can be informed about, is there an effect that you're going to see in NECAP or SBAC or anything else? Is there not? And do you care?
So have you ever tried to develop metrics for lifelong learning, or level of lifelong learning?
We have a really interesting project that we're trying to get off the ground about sort of discussing how to take those ends and really think about the measurability of them, and really think about how do we measure them as they exist, and how do we, can we look at synthesizing and sort of taking and looking at, well, what are the core skills that one develops for a lifelong love of learning, and how can we get at some of those things, and not necessarily to measure a lifelong love of learning, because we don't measure people who graduated 50 years ago and say, have you been loving learning your whole life? I mean, that's not an accurate way of assessing the school right now. But how do we get at what does it mean, and what is someone who loves learning, and how do you get at that? And we're really looking at that, and the boards have been a leader in that. I think they're doing a great job with it. So.
One thing it looks like is somebody who in their spare time spends a lot of time learning a really complex statistical model. That's one way it looks.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions?
Well, thank you. Well, thank you guys for coming and listening to me blather.
David, I think it's phenomenally thoughtful and helps move the conversation forward, obviously in some very tangible ways and then in some bigger conceptual ways too. So thanks for bringing this to the table.
I have one question in
Yeah.
terms of, you have said that you're giving free access. How would people do that? So in other words, people may be
Do you
watching
want
this
to
and-
repeat that question? Or?
Well, you go ahead and
Oh,
discuss.
so the question was, how am I giving free access? It's been almost exclusively on email.
And to who? Anyone?
Uh,
Do you have an audience?
So I've been presenting at conferences, presented at the Superintendent's Association conference last year and in various places, and I have relationships with the faculty of other supervisory unions, and so I do presentations at professional development days and leadership teams and things like that, and we sort of put it out through word of mouth and the networks and all of that. But I mean, anyone who wants it, all they have to do is request it of me, and I send them the tool, and if they want me to come and do follow up with them, or they want me to come and do actually in a couple of weeks going and doing a presentation with a data team in Addison County. So I mean, anybody who wants it, that's they can have it for free.
What's your email address?
DADLER@ossu.org.
And I will include your contact information when I post this. We have a wiki that serves as a resource clearinghouse for the Policy Governance Network. So I'll make sure. So that's what my plan. We actually recorded this session. I think I told you that ahead of time. I hope I did. So the recorded presentation will be available, and I'll include your contact information. So if people want to follow up with you to get access, they can do it that way. Okay, great. Well, again, thanks, and we'll look forward to seeing the work help us move forward. Okay, good.